Detroit, Michigan, September 15th, 1961. The narrow corridors of 2648 West Grand Boulevard buzzed with the controlled chaos of hit-making. Hitsville, USA, Berry Gordy's musical empire, hummed with the sounds of America's most ambitious record label. In Studio A, the Funk Brothers laid down tracks that would define a generation. In the offices upstairs, executives plotted the careers of future superstars. This was Motown, where dreams became gold records and unknowns became household names. But in the basement rehearsal room, sitting behind a modest drum kit, a 22-year-old from Washington, D.C., felt like an intruder in his own life. Marvin Gaye Jr. adjusted the snare drum for the third time that morning, his hands trembling slightly from nerves and caffeine. The basement was cramped, poorly ventilated, and filled with the musty smell of old wood and dampness. This was where the session musicians gathered before being called upstairs to the real studios, where the magic happened, where careers were born. Marvin had been working at Motown for 8 months now, ever since his doo-wop group, the Marquis, had dissolved, and Berry Gordy offered him steady work as a session drummer. It was honest work, paying work, but it felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Every morning he descended into this basement, took his place behind the drums, and watched as singers with half his talent were groomed for stardom while he remained invisible. His thin frame looked almost fragile behind the drum kit, his carefully pressed shirt already wilting in the basement heat. At 22, Marvin possessed a face that hadn't quite decided whether it belonged to a boy or a man. Soft features that could shift from vulnerability to intensity in a heartbeat. His eyes, deep and searching, held dreams that seemed too large for this cramped space. In quiet moments like this, Marvin's mind wandered to the voice lessons his mother had insisted on back in D.C., to the church choir where his soprano had once soared above the congregation. He remembered the way people's faces changed when he sang Precious Lord at Sunday service. The silence that followed, heavy with something close to reverence. That voice was still inside him somewhere, buried beneath months of keeping time for other people's dreams. The irony wasn't lost on him. Upstairs, singers struggled to find the notes that came to Marvin as naturally as breathing. He could hear them through the thin ceiling, stretching for melodies that seemed to live in his chest. Yet here he sat, relegated to rhythm, to background, to the basement where dreams went to wait. Sometimes in the dead space between recording sessions, Marvin would hum quietly to himself. Just fragments of melodies, pieces of songs that visited him in sleep or during long walks through Detroit's empty streets. The other musicians never seemed to notice, too focused on their own concerns to pay attention to a drummer's quiet humming. But those melodies felt more real to Marvin than anything else in his life, more true than the steady beat he was paid to provide. The other session musicians treated him with casual indifference. To them, he was just another body filling a spot, playing his part in Berry Gordy's assembly line of sound. They didn't know about the songs he wrote in his apartment at night, the melodies that kept him awake, the voice he practiced in empty hallways when no one was listening. Today felt different, though, heavier. The Supremes were upstairs recording what would become their next single, and Mary Wells was scheduled for an afternoon session. The real stars of Motown were working, and Marvin was relegated to the basement, counting time and keeping rhythm for artists who would never know his name. He closed his eyes and tried to center himself, the way his father had taught him to do before church services back in D.C. But instead of peace, he found only questions. How long could he pretend to be satisfied with anonymity? How many more months could he watch inferior singers get the opportunities he craved? How much longer before he admitted that maybe Berry Gordy had been right to see him as just another drummer? The basement door creaked open, interrupting his spiral of doubt. Harvey Fuqua, his mentor and the man who had brought him to Motown, descended the narrow stairs with his usual measured pace. Harvey had been a star himself once, the lead singer of the Moonglows, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who understood both sides of the music business. "Morning, Marvin," Harvey said, settling into a folding chair near the drum kit. "Ready for another day in paradise?" Marvin managed a weak smile. "Always ready, Mr. Fuqua." "Harvey, how many times I got to tell you? We're family here." Harvey studied Marvin's face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read people. "You look troubled, son. What's eating at you? For a moment, Marvin considered deflecting with humor or small talk, but the weight of his frustration was becoming unbearable, and Harvey had always been someone he could trust. I feel like I'm disappearing, Marvin said quietly. Every day, I come down here. I play the drums, I go home. Nothing changes. I watch singers half my age get recording contracts, and I'm just here. Harvey nodded slowly. He'd seen this before, the restlessness that came when talent outgrew its circumstances. Barry sees something in you, Marvin. Why else would he keep you around? He sees a reliable drummer. Nothing more. Maybe, or maybe he's waiting to see what you're really made of. Harvey stood up, brushing dust from his pants. There's a difference between being seen and being ready to be seen. Which one are you? Before Marvin could answer, footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Mickey Stevenson, Motown's head of A&R, appeared in the doorway, his expression businesslike and hurried. Harvey, good. I need to talk to you about the afternoon session. And Marvin, Mickey barely glanced in his direction. Make sure you're warmed up. We might need you upstairs if Robert White's running late. Mickey turned back to Harvey, and Marvin became invisible again. Just another piece of equipment to be moved when needed. They spoke in low voices about schedules and arrangements, treating his presence like furniture. But then Marvin heard something that stopped his breath. The new kid from Detroit, what's his name, Stevie Wonder. Barry thinks he might be our next big thing. 12 years old and already more mature than half our roster. What about our current artists? Harvey asked. Mary's session this afternoon. We'll go fine. She's a professional. But between you and me, Harvey, we need fresh blood. The same sound, the same faces. It's getting stale. Barry's looking for something different. Someone who can push us into new territory. Mickey paused, seeming to remember Marvin was in the room. No offense, Marvin. You're solid behind the kit. But we need singers, not more drummers. After they left, Marvin sat in the basement silence, their words echoing in his mind. We need singers, not more drummers. The casual dismissal hurt more than he'd expected, but it also crystallized something that had been building inside him for months. He thought about his childhood in Washington, D.C., about the songs he'd learned in church, about the voice that his mother had called a gift from God. He thought about the melodies that came to him unbidden, the lyrics he scribbled on napkins and scraps of paper. All of that creativity, all of that passion, reduced to, we need singers, not more drummers. Something shifted in Marvin's chest. Not anger exactly, but something deeper. A quiet determination that felt different from the desperate wanting he'd carried for months. For the first time since arriving at Motown, he wasn't thinking about what they might give him. He was thinking about what he could take. The afternoon session was scheduled to begin at 2 p.m., but by 1:30 the basement was buzzing with unusual activity. Word had spread that Gordy himself would be in the building, a rare occurrence that had everyone on edge. The session musicians gathered their instruments, straightened their clothes, and prepared for the possibility of being noticed by the man who controlled their careers. Marvin climbed the stairs from the basement to Studio A, his drumsticks in his back pocket, his heart beating with unusual rhythm. The main studio was everything the basement wasn't: spacious, well-lit, filled with professional equipment that represented the pinnacle of recording technology. This was where hits were born, where ordinary songs became extraordinary records. Mary Wells was already at the microphone, running through vocal exercises with the casual confidence of someone who belonged in this space. She acknowledged Marvin with a polite nod as he sat up behind the drums, the kind of recognition reserved for competent but unremarkable support staff. The Funk Brothers took their positions, James Jamerson on bass, Robert White on guitar, Earl Van Dyke at the piano. These were the men who created the Motown sound, anonymous masters whose playing had made stars of dozens of singers. Marvin had studied them for months, learning their techniques, their approaches, their ability to disappear into the service of the song. But today, disappearing felt like dying. Gordy entered the studio at exactly 2 p.m., his presence transforming the casual atmosphere into something charged with possibility and fear. He was shorter than Marvin had expected, but he carried himself with the authority of someone who had built an empire from nothing. Every conversation stopped. Every musician straightened up slightly, hoping to be noticed, hoping to matter. "Afternoon, everyone," Barry said, settling into the producer's chair behind the mixing board. "Let's make some magic." The session began smoothly. Mary Wells was in fine form, her voice effortlessly navigating the melody lines with the professionalism that had made her Motown's first major star. The arrangement was tight, the musicians locked into the groove that had made Motown famous around the world. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, but as Marvin played, something strange happened. The rhythm he was laying down began to evolve, to breathe, to suggest possibilities that hadn't been in the original arrangement. His hands were moving independently of his conscious mind, adding subtle accents and textures that complemented Mary's vocals without overwhelming them. Barry Gordy noticed first, his head tilted slightly, his attention shifting from Mary to the rhythm section, trying to identify the source of the new energy he was hearing. Mary finished the song, and the studio filled with the satisfied silence that follows a good take. But instead of moving on to the next song, Barry stood up from the mixing board and walked into the live room. "That was interesting," he said, his eyes scanning the musicians. Something different was happening in the rhythm section. More sophisticated than usual. James Jamerson shifted uncomfortably, wondering if he'd overplayed. Robert White checked his guitar tuning, suddenly self-conscious. But Barry's gaze settled on Marvin, who was still seated behind the drum kit, trying to process what had just happened. "Marvin, right? Harvey's boy?" "Yes, sir." "You've been working here, what, 8 months?" "Yes, sir, since January." Barry studied him with the intensity of someone who had built his fortune on recognizing potential before anyone else could see it. "You play differently than our other drummers. Less mechanical, more musical." Marvin didn't know how to respond to that. He'd been trying to disappear into the rhythm section, to be professional and reliable. The idea that his personality had somehow leaked into his playing was both terrifying and thrilling. "I try to serve the song, Mr. Gordy." "Yeah, I can hear that. But there's something else." Barry paused, and in that pause, Marvin felt the weight of possibilities shifting. "You write songs, don't you?" The question caught Marvin off guard. He'd never mentioned his songwriting to anyone at Motown except Harvey. "How did you—" "Harvey mentioned it, said you've got some interesting ideas." Barry's expression was unreadable. "Sing something." "Sir?" "Sing something. One of your songs." The studio went completely silent. Mary Wells lowered her headphones. The Funk Brothers stopped their casual noodling. Everyone understood that something significant was happening, but no one was quite sure what. Marvin felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't how he'd imagined his moment would come. No preparation, no perfect circumstances, just Barry Gordy standing in the middle of the studio, asking him to reveal everything he'd been hiding for 8 months. I'm not really prepared." "That's when the truth comes out," Barry said. "When you're not prepared. When you can't hide behind arrangements and production tricks. Just you and your voice." Marvin stood up from behind the drum kit, his legs unsteady. Walking to the center of the studio felt like crossing a vast distance, every step taking him further from the safety of anonymity. The microphone that Mary Wells had been using moments earlier now seemed enormous, intimidating, designed for people who belonged in spotlights. He thought about the song he'd been working on in his apartment, late at night when the world was quiet enough for him to hear his own thoughts. It was different from the Motown sound, more personal, more vulnerable. It was about feeling lost, about searching for identity, about the space between who you were and who you wanted to become. This is something I've been working on," Marvin said into the microphone, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not finished." "Nothing's ever finished," Barry replied. "Start singing." Marvin closed his eyes, trying to block out the faces watching him, the weight of judgment, the possibility of failure. When he opened his mouth, what came out was not the voice of a session drummer hoping for a break. It was something deeper, richer, more complex than anyone in that studio had expected. "I've been walking through these empty halls looking for a place where I belong. Every door I try seems locked away, but I keep moving. I keep moving on." The melody was simple, but Marvin's voice transformed it into something haunting and beautiful. There was pain in his tone, but also hope, vulnerability wrapped in strength. The voice of someone who had spent his life feeling like an outsider, finally finding the courage to speak from the inside. As he sang, something magical happened in the studio. James Jamerson's bass began to whisper underneath the melody, so subtly that it seemed to emerge from the song itself rather than being added to it. Robert White's guitar found delicate counterpoint phrases that complemented without competing. Even Earl Van Dyke's piano entered the conversation, adding texture and harmony that elevated the simple song into something magnificent. But it was Marvin's voice that held everything together. As he gained confidence, his vocal performance became more dynamic, more expressive. He wasn't just singing lyrics, he was telling a story, sharing a piece of his soul that had been hidden away for too long. When the impromptu performance ended, the silence in Studio A was profound and electric. Gordy stood motionless, his expression revealing nothing. Mary Wells had tears in her eyes. The Funk Brothers looked at Marvin as if seeing him for the first time. In that silence, Marvin felt exposed in a way he'd never experienced. Every emotion he'd buried during those months in the basement hung in the air around him. The longing, the frustration, the desperate hope that someone would finally see past the drum kit to the artist beneath. All of it was now visible, audible, undeniable. James Jamerson was the first to break the spell, setting down his bass with unusual gentleness. "Man," he said quietly, shaking his head, "where did that come from?" Robert White nodded slowly, as if he was still processing what he'd heard. "That wasn't just singing. That was something else." Mary Wells approached Marvin at the microphone, her professional composure softened by genuine surprise. "Honey, you've been hiding that voice all this time?" she asked, her tone mixing disbelief with something close to maternal concern. "Child, you've been doing yourself a disservice sitting behind those drums." But it was Earl Van Dyke who understood the magnitude of what had just happened. The veteran piano player had been at Motown since the beginning, had played behind every major star the label had produced. He knew the difference between technical competence and true artistry. "Barry," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "this boy's got something we don't manufacture here. This is the real thing." Finally, Barry spoke. "Harvey was right about you." He walked closer to Marvin, studying his face with new interest. "You're not a drummer who sings. You're a singer who happens to play drums." Marvin felt something shift inside his chest, as if a door that had been locked for years was finally opening. "I want you to forget about the drum kit for a while," Barry continued. "I want you to focus on developing as a vocalist. We're going to set up some sessions, see what you can really do when you're in front of the microphone instead of behind it." "Mr. Gordy, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet. Show me. Show me that what I just heard wasn't a fluke. Show me that you can be more than just another good voice in a city full of good voices." The transformation wasn't immediate. Over the following months, Marvin worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life, developing his vocal technique, learning to command a studio, building the confidence to stand in front of microphones instead of behind drum kits. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, sessions that didn't live up to the promise of that first performance. But Gordy had seen something authentic in Marvin Gaye, something that couldn't be manufactured or imitated. By 1962, Marvin had released his first single, "Stubborn Kind of Fellow," a song that showcased not just his vocal abilities, but his emerging identity as an artist who could bridge different worlds, gospel and secular, traditional and innovative, vulnerable and strong. The young man who had felt invisible in the basement of Hitsville, USA, was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood that true artistry came not from hiding your differences, but from embracing them completely. Years later, when Marvin Gaye had become one of the most important voices in popular music, he would look back on that September afternoon in Studio A as the moment when his real life began. Not because Gordy discovered him, but because he finally discovered himself. The drummer had become a singer. The invisible had become essential. The outsider had found his place by refusing to pretend he belonged anywhere but at the center of his own artistic vision. In the basement of Hitsville, USA, dreams were deferred. But in Studio A, they were born. And sometimes, if you were brave enough to stop hiding and start revealing, dreams had a way of changing not just your life, but the sound of music itself. The session that day lasted 3 hours. The legend it created would last forever.